Hello, hello. It is me, Legendary, and today I'm going to be yapping on about a factory Logi tier list for those logistics players who would like to know what should I build when you are faced with the scenario of sitting in front of a factory with a truck full of materials and you have so many options. What should you prioritize? What should you be making the most of? This list will help explain a broad overview of all the things that you can produce at your factory hubs in your logistics towns. Now, do take note that as each Foxhole war progresses, there are certain stages within the war where certain weapons are more valuable and more powerful when they unlock at the time a certain technology is available. So, for example, when you unlock the field anti-tank push guns, it's at that point where something like 68mm becomes very, very valuable. But before that, 68mm is relatively useless because there is no weapon that can fire it. So keep this sort of scenario in mind when you are figuring out what you want to produce at these factories. But broadly speaking, later on in the game, there are some very clear patterns and clear strengths to certain equipment over each other. So the idea behind this tier list is to give you a priority list on what to produce lots of and a sort of less priority when you only need a couple of these things to help shape the outcomes of your storage depots, which will ultimately then affect what soldiers will have when they fight. Now, this is a complicated tier list, and I'm going to be making some generalizations on a lot of the equipment, but broadly speaking here, the goal of this tier list, and you'll see the structure of it in just a moment, is that you prioritize making more of one certain item over another. And I've structured the tier list to reflect this. So when you are sitting in front of the factory and you're figuring out what to make, use the tier list as a guide in selecting how many queues you're going to be making of certain things. And please, for the love of all goodness, this is not a weapon tier list. If I say the Lowcaster is an S tier item to make inside of a factory queue, that does not mean that the Lowcaster is the best rifle in the game and I'm going to go and yell about it and balance reasons, blah, 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 blah. This is not the point of this tier list. I'm considering the cost of the items that are being produced and what impact they have on the general use case for frontline players and other use cases. That's the sort of main caveat when it comes to a tier list like this. So this is not a weapon balance discussion video. This is I am sitting in the front of the factory and I need to know what to make video. That's what the goal of this is. All right. So speaking of factories, for new players, this is what the factory UI looks like. This is just taken straight from the wiki. Again, props to all the wiki guys. I love you guys. So when you're in front of a factory, you essentially have a central, basically like cookbook, where you get to choose all the items that you want to make, and then the costs will be shown to you on the right hand side that you then have to commit and then collect later on. And each category has a whole bunch of items in that you can make, and you can cook simultaneous items at the same time. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be comparing all the items in the frequency at which you should be making them. So near the top of the tier list, you want to be producing, 4 items every single time you want to cook. And you can multiply this by the number of times you're going to be sitting in front of the factory to make all these various things. So top priority is make lots of these things. Low priority is make less of them. And then there will also be a tier list where you should just completely avoid something because it is only situationally good. And unless you have a very, very specific niche use case for them, try and avoid them for the majority of the time. All right. The next thing to talk about then is the traditional sort of logistics pyramids. Now, this one is taken from Fmat's Reddit post that they constantly update. And I will say that this video does not directly reflect the opinions of these type of posts. Specifically, the point of these supply pyramids, or these little, structures that come out from various regiments, is these are targeted towards people that are delivering goods to bunker bases. Now, one could argue that these pyramids should form a basis of what you should be creating in the backlines, but that doesn't always reflect what is necessary in a broad terms. Now, you can totally ignore my tier list and just focus on making supplies in the priority of these pyramids, and that's perfectly fine, and that is a very good strategy, and a lot of people do that. However, I do think that when you're making lots of supplies in the backlines and that then needs to be transported to the front or to a midline logistics hub, you want to have a priority on more frequent items as opposed to what needs to be going into a bunker base at a given time. Additionally, when you are feeding supplies into a midline logistics hub, do keep in mind that the items will be dispersed over multiple fronts. So you might want to have 300 crates of basic rifles in your midline logistics hub because it's going to be supplying multiple bunker bases that are being built to push the front forward. And a tier list like this will only prioritize what is being delivered to a singular bunker base based on the battlefield scenario that is currently unfolding for that push or for that defense. All right, so you can use these supply pyramids, totally fine. I do support them, and this is a great one by Fmat, awesome illustration. But keep in mind that this tier list is more what your stockpiles are hopefully going to be looking like when you are on the front line. Additionally, I will try my best to give both Colonial and Warden recommendations. However, do realize that I am mostly a Colonial player, and my Warden logistic experience is probably 1/10 of my gameplay. So I might not give the best Warden advice, but I will certainly not try and deceive you. And please don't think that I'm here to do some stupid Colonial psyops thing, because that's not how I do things. If you do think that of me, then you are horribly, horribly mistaken. All right, let's jump into it and talk about what the tier list is going to look like. So the tier list is literally from don't make this at all to make this very infrequently. This is a very common item. You should be making it lots of. This is a great item. You can definitely put a lot of resources into it. And then my 4 out of 4 S tier is you need to be making this the entire war, and don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. All right. Additionally, throughout this video, I will be making some generalizations on some of the items. There will be certain scenarios where they are situationally good, but for broadly speaking, or broad uses, that they are left to be relegated to only being made by the people who are actually going to be using them. So even though I have a 0 out of 4, you should never make these, situationally, sometimes you just need a little bit of barbed wire. So then you could make like a crate of barbed wire to go in there. All right, but let's jump into it. And I'm going to be going through all the different categories within the factories. And again, I'm going to be making some generalizations just to try and save on some time. Okay, so the first thing inside the small arms division is the basic starting rifles for both factions. For the Wardens, this is the Laucaster, and for the Colonials, this is the Argenti. Now, I'm going to pair these two together, as this is my first generalization saying that these are essentially the starting rifles within Foxhole. And you can produce this at the very start of the game, and everyone is accustomed to using them. All basic infantry know how to use the Argenti on the Colonial side, and all Wardens know how to use the Lancaster, and both of them have their individual strengths. Again, this is not a weapon tier list. I'm not comparing the two. I'm considering whether or not, how often you should be making these. Now, for starting rifles, these are S tier. You should be making them all the time. You always want to have a starting rifle kit in every single bunker base that is being built on the front. Every single safe house needs to have a stockpile of these rifles ready in case your defensive line collapses. So these are top priority. You want thousands of these available everywhere, and the corresponding ammo will follow in just a bit. So for starting rifles, the Lancaster and the Argenti, you always want to be producing lots of these. So don't feel bad of just constantly dumping 400 BMATs to make these. They're great to have. No one's going to complain when you're dropping rifles inside of a push bunker. It is the essential tool to fight above just using your starting pistol or bonking people with your hammer. All right. The next thing to talk about is going to be specialist rifles. Now, I'm not going through every single rifle on both the Colonial and the Warden side, so I'm just going to generalize this by showcasing the Hangman, and for the Colonials, I'm going to generalize by picking, which one should I use? Probably the, let's go with the Fushina. So again, this is a generalization. This is meant to represent all the specialist rifles outside of the starting rifles. Now for specialist rifles, these go into B tier. They don't fight as well as the starting rifles. There are certain rifles that do some level of performance over the basic ones, but for the most part, you want your infantry to be mostly armed with the starting rifles, and then you have some specialist infantries with long rifles or suppression rifles or burst rifles, etc., if the need arises. So you can make these every so often, but your starting rifles are objectively just better. So you want to be making more of these whenever possible. Okay, so again, I'm not comparing the Hangman and the Fushina to all the other rifles, and I'm not going to be adding more. These are quote-unquote specialist rifles or alternative basic rifles. You put them in B tier. Make them every now and then, but don't prioritize spamming them in general. All right. So the next thing to then talk about is shotguns. Now, shotguns are relatively new in the fact that they've been rebalanced for the infantry update. And both the Colonial and the Warden shotguns have their own merits. But generally speaking, shotguns are incredibly close range, and for the most part, they get countered by things like submachine guns as well as scoped in rifles. So you need to be a little bit wary supplying too many of these to the front line. So I'm going to be putting these in C tier just because it's okay to see them sometimes, but generally speaking, you want your infantry again to more focused on rifle gameplay, as they provide the most versatility, the most range, and the most damage output for the BMAT cost that is associated with them. All right. So shotguns, kind of mid-tier in terms of just weapons in general. So you don't want to be making too much of them as necessary. All right. The next is going to be the specialist pistols. This is for the Wardens. This is the Cascadier. I think that's how it's pronounced. And then for the Colonials and, well, the Wardens as well, you have the revolver. These are incredibly niche, superficial weapons. You don't really need to make a lot of them at all. for people who enjoy playing with them, they'll most likely make them themselves. So you don't need to be spamming sidearms. And with the infantry update that came out in November, December, there have been a plethora of new side weapons that have been introduced for the secondary slots, and those tend to perform a little bit better in this situation. So don't produce too many pistols. I know they're very cheap and easy to make. You really don't need a lot of them, and people who enjoy playing with them will, like I said, most likely bring their own. Right. The next thing to then talk about is submachine guns. Now, this is where we're actually going to see our first split. So up until now, I've been grouping all these items together because generally speaking, they tend to perform the same. However, there is a bit of a distinction in submachine guns. So we are going to see things a little bit differently. So first, let's talk about Warden submachine guns. This is mostly aimed at the fiddler, but the lyre is somewhat decent to make as well. For Wardens, submachine guns are a top priority. They are really good at night fighting and suppressing. So making lots of Warden submachine guns is a good idea. So submachine guns for Wardens goes into S tier. For Colonial submachine guns, they are still somewhat decent, but they don't have the same rate of fire and bleed chance as the Warden ones. I don't know, for some reason the fiddler and the lyre just always seem to bleed whenever you get hit by it. So for Colonials, you want to make your submachine guns a little bit less of a priority, but still decent and a good alternative to the starting rifles. Alright, so that's the ranking for submachine guns for the faction split, and I do consider them a little bit different to one another. Right. So, with that being said, I think we've now covered the majority of the small arms, at least when it comes to the basic starter gear. There are still a couple of additional ones that we need to run through. The first one is going to be the heavy machine guns. And this is where refined materials start to come into play. So first, let's talk about the Colonial gassed submachine gun. This is a exceptionally good weapon if you have the Rmats to invest into it. Mobile 12.7 cannot be understated that it is very good for suppressing, taking out tier 1 structures and suppressing push guns. So if you have the Rmats to make the gassed machine gun, definitely put that in. And I'm also similarly going to put the Malone in here. So heavy machine guns are really, really good. If you can make them, definitely make them. You always want to have some heavy infantry sitting inside of trenches or sitting in key positions to hold down areas while heavier ordnance gets moved into position. So both are exceptionally good. So I'm going to put heavy machine guns, the generalization amongst them, as S tier. Additionally, I also would like to just put in the Colonial light machine gun. To see if I could find it. Katara is in its own category. Here we go. I'm also going to put the Colonial Katara in this Cook tier list. I keep moving that. Here we go. Because, again, it is a mobile form of 12.7. It is exceptionally good to have in combination with your basic rifles that we've set out so far. All right, again, if you have the Rmats or the refined materials to make these, definitely put some resources into them. Having 12.7 can't go wrong, so you want to have these as frequent as possible. Okie dokie. Next thing to now talk about is going to be the assault rifles. And we are going to see another sort of split focus here because these two do differ in their outcomes. So the Wardens have two storm rifles, the Booker and the Alto. These are okay storm rifles. You don't need a lot of them amongst your infantry because, like I said, Wardens mostly prioritize their basic rifles as well as their submachine guns. So these are on par with their specialist rifles. You know, you sometimes want to see an Alto, or you sometimes want to see a Booker, or you sometimes, for example, want to see a Hangman, just by comparison. But your frequent infantry use case is going to be submachine guns and rifles for Wardens. So their storm rifles are not as high priority comparatively. However, the Colonials have a mean assault rifle, and it is the undisputed best fighting weapon for fighting in nighttime, the dusk. You always want to see dusks. Dusks are awesome. So for Colonial assault rifles, which again we only have one of currently, you want to see this very frequently. So make as many dusks as you can, put them in the front line. They are basically our equivalent to the Fiddler, but they cost Rmats. Now again, this is not a weapon tier list, I'm not comparing the two, but you want to see lots, as a Colonial, on the Colonial side, you want to see lots of dusks on the front, because they supplement and support your Argentis and your Omens, etc. So these are really, really nice to have. So I think I've covered most of the small arms actual weapons, except we need to talk about the sniper rifles. Now again, we're going to see a bit of a faction difference here, because each side has their own strength in terms of sniper rifles. Let's talk about let's do the Warden sniper rifle first, just because I think I've had this pattern of talking about the Warden stuff first so far. So the Warden sniper rifle is infrequently good to have, so I'm going to be putting it in B tier. Again, this is an exceptional sniper rifle to use. It's really fun, it one-taps, but you don't want to see these very, very often. However, just because of their strength, they do get a B tier rating over the Colonial C tier one. You sometimes want to see the Colonial one. It's not the absolute greatest, but if you are prioritizing taking out a trench line that's being covered by tripod mounted weaponry, sniper rifles is the safest way to do it without putting your tank lines at risk from, you know, being overwhelmed or being rushed. So you do want a sniper rifle. It's also really good for decrewing things like Starbreakers and the Colonial one, the Raptura. So in that regard, the Warden sniper rifle just outperforms. And if you have some Rmats to throw at the problem, I would definitely put these in here like so. I think near the end of the video, I will color code these a little bit better. I know it's a little hard for newer players to sort of see that, you know, I can't tell the difference between what that is and what that is. So I will do some color coding a little bit later on. But for the most part, let's just get through the tier list and then we'll make it a little bit better so that you can pause the video once the final thing is done and then take a look at what the result is, at what you should be making, etc. All right. Now with that, and let me just double check, but I think I've covered all the basic weapons. Just running through all of it. All right, yes, okay. So for this first part, for small arms, the top priority is basic rifles for both factions, all the heavy machine guns, or the 12.7 ones for both factions as well. For Wardens, the S tier is definitely your submachine guns, and for Colonials, our assault rifle is better, so we have an S tier ranking for our assault rifle. For Colonial submachine guns, go into A tier. The sort of specialist rifles, or the non-standard basic rifles, B tier is fine as well. Warden assault rifles are in here, Warden sniper rifles here, and then shotguns and Colonial snipers are kind of down here, and then the specialist handguns, not a priority at all, so you can avoid making them. All right, but that's not it. Just it for what you should be making in the small arms category. These were just the weapons. Let's talk about the grenades. And from here on forward, we should see some very, very specific tier rankings as well. So most of the generalizations at this point forward should be over. So let's talk about the Warden Harper. the Warden Hopper grenade is good for clearing trenches. It can be fired out of weapons. It can be shot out of vehicle turrets. So again, this is your starting to advance on enemy fixed positions. You need to clear out foxholes. You need to clear out trenches. You need to push forward. You need to suppress infantry from just sitting down inside of their hidey holes. So the Harper is really good at doing that, but you don't need a whole lot of them. So for the Warden Harper, I'm going to put it under C tier. You do need to make some of them, and they're useful to have, but generally speaking, their lack of range and their necessity to be shot out of Ospreys make them an infrequent choice compared to another grenade, which we'll take a look at in just a bit. For the Colonial Stone, this goes slightly higher. The Stone used to be an exceptionally good weapon a couple of patches ago, but due to some arguably needed nerfs to their throw range and their mobility, they don't quite go into S tier, so I put the Stone under A tier now. It is still exceptionally good on Colonial Infantry just because we also have access to the Grenadier uniform, which allows you to stack quite a lot of Stones on a single infantry unit. But essentially, you still need to clear trenches, you still need to advance, and the Colonial Stone is still really good at doing that. Its definite bleed chance makes it really good for staggering enemies and then rushing a trench, whereas the Warden one is more of you need to land the grenade exactly on where the enemy is to kill them. So the Warden one has more stopping power, but the Colonial one has more AoE and more additional effects that the Colonial Infantry can take advantage of. So you want to make these quite often, and the Warden one, we'll talk about the last grenade now. So that's it for the grenades. Let's talk about the green ash grenade. So this is the gas grenade. This is an exceptional weapon. If you have the materials to make it for both factions, you gotta make it. You just gotta have tons and tons of crates of these. This is what you use to push objectives, because you gas people that are trying to repair structures or to repair bunker bases. You use them to decrew tanks. You use them for area denial, very important. Like if you're advancing into a position and you're unsure if there's enemies, you literally just have like 3 or 4 infantry just run up and throw gas grenades or launch them out of their respective grenade launchers. And Wardens specifically love using these because it is just an objective better Harper for what it's useful for. So for both factions, you want to be producing these en masse. Colonials have a bit of an easier time because our Stones are still quite relevant throughout the majority of the war. But for their general use case, you always want to have your infantry be throwing gas grenades as often as possible. Even with the changes to how gas grenades function with the infantry update, they are still objectively good. So always make gas grenades so they go into S tier. Right, just clean a few things up here and let's move on. Okay, again, sticking to small arms before we get into ammo. The last item to consider when we are producing items in this category is the smoke grenade. Now, smoke grenades have an interesting mechanic in the fact that when you throw a smoke grenade on top of a garrison, an AI controlled garrison specifically, like a rifle garrison or machine gun garrison, as well as pillboxes, then the accuracy of the AI shooting out of that structure is reduced while the smoke is active. Do take note, this does not apply to anti-tank garrisons. So AT pillboxes and AT garrisons are not affected by smoke. This is a common misconception, and this is something that I personally tested in the dev branch in November. The smoke grenades do not affect tank stuff, but for infantry stuff, this one is situationally good, and you sometimes want to have a couple of crates of them just so that you can fulfill a Boma Stone Rush, or if you want to blind the enemy's field of vision so that you can sneak in and wrench some mines or wrench some barbed wire or something like that. You sometimes want a little bit of smoke. I wouldn't put them as completely useless, never make it. You sometimes need a smoke grenade just to move into a position and do some sort of covert opsy stuff, or to facilitate something like a Mammon Rush or a Satchel Rush or a Hydra Rush, etc. Smoke grenades, a little bit underrated in their use cases, but you don't want every infantry on the front to have one, but sometimes you need to have some dudes in partisan gear make use of them. So I'll put them under C tier. Alright, now we get into ammo. And ammo is basically going to follow loosely with the weaponry that I've situated in at this point. So for both teams, the ammo priority is going to look something a little bit like this. Rifle ammo, which is 7.62 millimeters. This is S tier. You need thousands and thousands of crates of this. So always produce rifle ammo. And again, this is also supplemented by the fact that all the specialist rifles, for the most part, also use 7.62 as well. Sniper rifles also use 7.62. So it is just objectively the most common ammo type on the battlefield. You need lots of it. So spam it comfortably. You're always going to need 7.62 as the war progresses. Next is 12.7. This is machine gun ammo. Also S tier, actually. You can comfortably make machine gun ammo. Most vehicles also have the ability to shoot 12.7 as well. Colonial tanks rely on 12.7. So high priority for Colonial players to have lots of 12.7 available. As soon as the push guns unlock, they're relevant. And all the emplaced machine guns and tripod weapons use 12.72. So really, really good. Can't go wrong making 12.7 by the train load even. Next is storm rifle ammo. This is 7.92. I sometimes call it 7.82 because I'm stupid, but this is the 7.92. It's used by armored cars, used by assault rifles. This is A tier ammo type. You don't need to spam an infinite amount of it because it is mostly just used by certain vehicles and the appropriate storm rifles that they get loaded into. This doesn't go into S tier specifically for Colonials, even though we make a lot of Dusks, simply because you still need to strike a balance with supplying enough storm rifle for your armored vehicles as well as what your infantry is going to be throwing out as well. So it goes into A tier. You do want to be making this every so often, specifically once armored cars tech. You'll see a lot of people be making a lot of this. So there should be a decent stockpile in most storage depots for assault rifle ammo, but not as high priority as the rifle ammo and the heavy machine gun or the 12.7 ammo. Cool, let's move on and talk about some of the other specialist ammos that we have. 9mm. So I'm going to put 9mm under S tier as well, just because both factions use submachine guns, but a slight caveat, this is a much higher priority for Wardens. Because of the Warden submachine gun preference, I will say that you always want to have 9mm available so that your fiddlers are loaded and your lyres have ammo. And then if you're playing Colonial, sometimes you want to throw out a Lion Claw, or sometimes you want to throw out some of the additional sidearms. But both are quite important. You want your infantry to have these. So it goes under S tier, but if you're a Warden and you're watching this is possibly, higher up in the priority tier list to make. All right. So let's take a look here. I think that's everything except for 0.44. So 0.44 is the specialist ammo. Meh. goes under D tier. It's only used by the Cometa pistol as well as the Warden Hangman, which is a specialist rifle. So for the most part, you don't want to be producing too much of this. If you are producing Hangman in the B tier, if you're a Colonial factory worker, then just make enough clips to go with the rifles. And if you're making revolvers, also make it with. But generally speaking, can you fill thousands and thousands and thousands of crates of these inside of your storage depots? No, because the weapons are a little bit lackluster in their use case. I know there's a lot of Hangman elitists that love to use it. It's a really good long rifle. I'm not going to dispute that, but you're not going to be using more than like 4 or 5 clips of these before you get taken down. So you don't need too much of it. So it goes into D tier. Just make it when you create the pistol, the Hangman. Otherwise, just ignore it. Right. So just taking a look here. Oh, we need to talk about shotgun shells. I'm going to put them at the same level as the shotgun. If you're making shotguns, cool, make it. Yeah, otherwise, again, don't need to prioritize it greatly. Shotguns are not that impactful on the battlefield. You don't need millions of them, but every now and then having a secondary shotgun or a specialist with a shotgun is useful, and they need the ammo to fire it. Cool. All right, I think that's it at this point for the basic small arms category, and I'll keep it at that and move on to heavy arms. And this is where things get interesting, because now we start to add in the costs to explosive materials, and more refined materials start to see play here. So I think for this category, I'm just going to switch things up a little bit. I think I'm going to do all the neutral weapons first. So this is weapons that both sides can do. Then I'll do Warden, and then I'll do Colonial. I think that'll probably be a little bit of better flow for the video. So let's talk about our first generic weapon type, which is the RPG. And the RPG is going to see different priorities between both Colonial and Warden. And this is, again, where I'm going to make a bit of a distinction, and I'm going to say that green... Ooh, that doesn't show up very well as well. Let's just make it a little bit bigger. Even bigger, maybe. There we go. And I'm going to add a distinction here for blue as well. And there is different priorities for making RPGs between the two factions. So here we're going to see some faction variations. For Colonials, RPG is a low priority because it is only used in our vehicles. So only vehicles make use of RPGs, or if you're able to steal some Warden vehicles off of the front, or Warden vehicles, or Warden weapons, sorry, infantry weapons. But for Wardens, you always want to have lots of RPG because it's used in your tripod weapons, and it is also used in your cutler, which is your main PvE tool that the Wardens have access to. So for Colonials, you sometimes want to make a couple of RPG rounds just so that the odd Icarus or the odd Gemini has something to shoot. But for Wardens, since the prevalence of cutlers and the fact that you need a lot of cutlers to siege down very well entrenched areas, Wardens do prioritize making RPG shells above all the other explosives in this category. So always make it on blue side. Every now and then on green side is perfectly acceptable. Right, the next is 20mm. Now, this is a bit of a controversial weapon type. I'm going to make it yellow just because, it's a little bit controversial because we're still trying to figure out how 20mm works. 20mm got a massive change in the infantry update. It has gone from being able to kill tanks to suppressing tanks and stripping armor using the new specialist weapons. So I still think that you need to see some 20mm in the front. So I'm going to put it under C tier. This is a little bit more favored by Wardens because of the Level 20, but a lot of the Wardens have stopped using the Level 20 en masse like it used to be. So you still want to see 20mm, just not as often. Actually, I'm just going to get rid of the border because it'll get confusing. But it still is a relatively good source of damage to have if you supplement it with explosives. On its own, 20 mil is just crap now. But you add it in with sticky grenades, you add it in with RPG or 30 mil, then 20 mil is still useful to have. So it gets in the, make it sometimes C tier. Just don't spam it as often or as frequently as it used to be. So leave 20 mil there. There'll probably be some updates to this later on, but for the most part, still somewhat relevant to have. Okay, flare mortars. So flare mortars is what you use to see at night. Both factions need this. I'm going to put it under B tier. Very, very handy and useful to have, specifically when you have to advance at night to take advantage of certain night attacks, as well as revealing push guns and preventing certain areas from being controlled by the enemy. So flares are very useful. You need to just having flares is a deterrent for enemies from attacking or revealing counter flanks during risky operations at night. If you shoot a flare as an infantry while your tank line is advancing at night, you will be the most loved player on that battlefront. Trust me. Okay, the next thing is shrapnel mortar. Shrapnel mortar? Meh. It's okay. You sometimes want to toss in a crate or two of it in your factory queues. You don't need to see a lot of shrapnel. They're not as useful as the other mortar types, specifically with the introduction of fire mortars, which won't be in this tier list because it's not made at a factory. But again, you load it into mortar houses. You sometimes toss it into your mortar half track or your mortar tank to suppress an enemy, or if you want to prevent tanks from repairing. This is also decent to have. Yeah, I think for its cost, it's okay, but you don't need to make lots of it. So mortar shrapnels goes in there, or goes into C tier, and basically every now and then just toss a crate into your storage containers to go to the front. Cool. The next is the mortar shell. This is a top priority because this is relevant for naval gameplay throughout the entire war. You always want to have HE mortars in every seaport. You always want to have HE mortars inside of your mortar house storage depot towns. They are frequently used by both teams to assail certain positions depending on what is accessible and easy to use. HE mortars, always relevant, always strong. You always want to be making these. Even though you do have artillery shells that trump these in terms of their damage output, you still want to be able to have your gunboats fully prepped, your mortar houses fully prepped, and the occasional push using your auxiliary weaponries. So HE mortars gets S tier. If you can make it, make them. And this is exceptionally more important if you're playing on island hexes. If you're playing on an island hex, you need to be making these daily. Because HE mortars is your only, or not your only, but HE mortars is your initial defense against naval vessels. It's the first thing that can hit them. Everything else is heavily affected by ship armor. Maybe that's a topic I'll talk about another day, about how to combat ship armor. But for today, make HE mortars. Very useful. And when HE mortars tech, that's when tier 2 bases really start to sweat. Because you can shred tier 2 bases with enough mortar tubes and HE mortars to pound them. Okay, so that's it for all the basic mortars. I think along that vein, let's talk about the Kremari mortar tube. This is a useful weapon to make. You don't need to spam a lot of them. So I'm going to put them under B tier. Again, this is more of a support tool throughout the majority of the war. You do want to see a couple of Kremari mortar tubes inside your storage depots, but you don't need to see hundreds of them. They're not a super high priority because as the game progresses, the higher ordnance just takes preference. Now, you might be wondering, well, hey, wait a second, you put the mortar tube over here, but the actual HE mortars is S tier. And again, that's because I'm accounting for the fact that HE mortars is primarily used by gunboats and mortar houses and mortar tanks. And then every other time, you might have a small squad of 4 to 5 guys with mortar tubes like pounding a tier 2 base or a fixed position. So they're still decent. But for PvE options, both factions have something better, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So we'll leave the mortar tube under B tier for here. Cool. All right. Now let's talk about the Tremola grenade. And we're going to see a faction split here again, because the Tremola grenade is different between the two factions. So we're going to color this one green again, and we're going to color it blue. There we go. So for Colonials, this is our S tier weapon because of the Lunaire grenade launcher. This is our premier way of destroying Warden in transposition using infantry gear. You want to be spamming Tremolas the moment the Lunaire unlocks for the rest of the war. You always want to have thousands and thousands and thousands of crates of these. They are used everywhere. This is our premier weapon to push things. So Wardens use their Cutler launchers to push in transpositions. We use Tremolas. And similarly, there are some Warden vehicles that use Tremolas, like the O'Brien Nave, as well as their super heavy tank. But it is very, very infrequent to see those on the front. So I'm actually going to put the Tremola as a D tier weapon for Wardens. You almost never want to make it. Now for Colonial weapons, we sometimes use RPG vehicles, so that's why the RPG is here. But for Warden Tremolas, the people that are going to be using the Tremolas will bring their own. And when Wardens capture the Colonial grenade launcher, it's for its ability to shoot gas grenades at incredibly long distances, not for the fact that it can siege bases with Warden Tremolas that were created. So you don't want to be making any of those as the Wardens, so it goes into D tier until the devs decide to add a better Tremola platform for the Wardens. But as of the current balance, that is not the case. Right, so let's go and talk about Arc RPG. So Arc RPG is the ammo that you put inside of the Warden Bonesaw family, as well as the Colonial Polybos defensive emplacement. I'm going to put this under A tier for both, and I'm not going to do a faction split on Arc RPG because you need Arc RPG in your Polybolos for the Colonials. It's our premier defense against tank dives. You need Polybolos to defend against chieftain rushes. You need Polybolos for just general tank fighting and pushing forward and emplacing new defenses against tanks, specifically because Wardens love to do tank lines, and the Polybolos is one of the weapons that helps break up tank lines until outlaws show up and kill them. But it is a high priority, and on the Warden side, you need Arc RPG because that is the only ranged or decently ranged anti-tank weapon that the Wardens have, because they do not have access to armor-piercing RPG. So, useful for both sides. Colonials for defensive weapons, and for Wardens, they're anti-tank weapons. As well as the Wardens have a lot of Arc RPG options on their vehicles, because they have a mounted version for the Arc RPG launcher, as well as the Bone Law, which is shredding front lines, and they're very fun to see them in action. So if you bring a whole bunch of Arc RPGs to a relic base or to a bunker base, I'm very sure that there will be some Warden Bone Law enthusiasts who would definitely toss you some comments. So it is a priority for both. Just it's not S tier. You don't need to spam thousands of these, but having a decent supply of Arc RPGs for the Colonial side will help us defend against tank lines, and for Wardens it allows them to use their launched options, either in tripod format or sometimes their shoulder-mounted arc ammo firing solutions. Cool. Next is the sticky bomb grenade. Don't stretch. Here we go. Sticky bombs, always useful. Both sides. It is the easiest way for infantry to fight tanks. It is the best way to snipe tanks en masse. You have 3 or 4 sticky rushers run in, disable a tank, track it, and then blow it up. You always want thousands of crates of sticky bombs, objectively, on both sides. It is the best anti-tank weapon for infantry in the game currently, due to the infantry changes. It is also lighter to hold. You can hold more sticky bombs than ever before. Dangerous, deadly. Definitely want to have lots of sticky bombs. So goes under S tier for sure. And its compatriot, the Mammon. So the Mammon is always useful in my opinion. I always want to see lots and lots of Mammons on the front, but it does go under A tier once you start unlocking more things in the game. So generally speaking, Mammons are useful for sieging bases early, and then mid to late game Mammons are useful for taking out key strategic emplacements, taking out watchtowers. Basically, it's the only thing that infantry can have to break anything from tier 2 and above without the need for a dedicated weapon to use it. So, yeah, still useful. In a pinch, can, destroy an armored car or disable or fuel a tank, but you'd rather have stickies to do that. And if you're seriously sieging an entrenched position, Wardens use RPGs, Colonials use Tremolas, so you still want to see lots of Mammons. So always make them, but they're not high priority later on in the game, so A tier they go. Alrighty, so that's it for... so I almost forgot the 30mm. 30mm. For both teams, I'm going to put this under A tier. Previously, Colonials favored 30mm more than Wardens did, but with the introduction of the Brigand as another main production tank for Wardens, 30mm has seen a rise in significance, and Wardens now also rely on 30mm to do light forms of PvE with, just because of the Brigand's rapid fire cannon, or it's like triple shot. So 30mm, very relevant, very useful to have throughout the war. So it goes into A tier. It is the cheapest form of anti-tank damage that you can have, just purely on the fact that you get a lot of 30mm per crate when you produce it. So it's definitely a worthwhile investment to toss some explosive powder into making these. Yeah, I love 30mm. I'd like to have lots of crates on them everywhere. Colonials use our tripod weapons, use 30mm, and Wardens have vehicles that are now relevant to late game, to using 30mm as well. So always have 30mm on hand, always handy to supply into your frontline bunkers. Alrighty, so that's it for the generic heavy arms. Let's talk about the faction-specific ones now. Warden Flask Grenade. This has seen some significant nerfs over the infantry update. I am putting this under B tier in terms of its priority to make. Wardens have been relying more on sticky grenades, but its ability to shred armor cannot be understated when you are attacking a attacking force. So let me put it this way. If the Colonials are pushing into a region that doesn't have a garage, specifically with armor, obviously, then flasks become way more important, because flasks have a 100% chance to deal armor damage now. So if you hit a battle tank with a flask, you are doing permanent damage to it that it would need to retreat 1 or 2 hexes back to repair at a garage. So they're no longer this infinitely tracking anti-tank grenade solution, but they are really good at punishing and attacking force. So you could call it a defensive weapon, but it's not a true defensive weapon, but it's good for punishing and attacking force. So I still think the flasks is good. It's not as spammable as the other weapons on this list now, but it's still useful to have. And I know a couple of large Warden regiments have decided to deprioritize making flasks. So this used to be up here, always have it everywhere, but now it's like a niche defensive tool to punish tanks that don't have access to a garage more readily. So it goes under B tier. I still think personally it's a great weapon, but it's a little bit harder to use. Its throw distance and throw speed was nerfed quite a lot. So yeah, still okay to make, at least in terms of the factory tier list. Like, you still want to be making them, but I would prioritize pumping the resources into sticky grenades over these instead. Cool, let's talk about the Varsi. So this is the grenade launched anti-tank explosive. This is essentially an alternative to the Tremola. Whereas the Tremola can be launched by the Colonial grenade launcher, the Varsi needs to be launched using the Osprey attachment. I personally like using this weapon, but you don't need to see a lot of it. It's really good for destroying tag targets. It's really good for clearing out tripod weapons. So I'm going to be putting my personal bias in saying that this is an awesome grenade and it's just underutilized. And I'm going to put this under C tier. You do want to see some of these. There is situations where they're very handy to have. Specifically, if there's a big sort of tank battle going on and you just want to lob these all around. They're great to have, but you need a very specialist kit on Warden Infantry to make use of them. And they're not as easily deployable or spammable as sticky grenades or mammons or anything like that. So it goes into C tier. Until I see some changes to this will probably not move out. But it's definitely not D tier. It's not like you never want to see these. There are certain situations where Varsis are useful. Taking out support weapons is really good. Like if you find a Colonial artillery position and they're not prepared, 2 or 3 Warden Infantry with Varsi grenades can destroy an entrenched 120 position on the Colonial side. So they're not useless, but they require a little bit of forethought to use. So therefore, you don't want to have them as common on the battlefield as, like I said, like a sticky grenade or a RPG shell for the Wardens. So goes under C tier. Make it sometimes, but not very frequently. All right, let's talk about the Warden Neville 20. I'm going to put this under B tier with the flask, because for the same reason that it is good at punishing tanks that don't have access to a garage. 20 mil now always shreds armor. It shreds armor less than the flask does. The flask is 100% armor damage, and the Neville 20, you still need to land the shot first, so it needs to scope in. It's not as powerful as it used to be. Neville 20s were mostly used to track targets and to just deal constant damage, as well as dealing with armored cars. You still want to be making these because at least they only cost BMATs still. So they are the premier BMAT counter to tanks. But you're not going to be killing tanks with the Neville 20. So that's why it doesn't get higher. You still want to see them, just not as frequently as you did before. So I put them on par with the flask in terms of their usability. You punish tanks with them. You don't destroy tanks with them. And the suppression mechanics, we're still figuring out. So maybe once suppression becomes more significant, there'll be a higher priority to make. But for now, I think Wardens will agree that it's an okay rifle to have sometimes. Just, you don't want to have every infantry with it anymore. You want to have the sporadic, odd infantryman with the 20 mil. So that's why I'm going to put it under B tier. Next is the Warden Ratcatcher. The Ratcatcher isn't that significant. You don't see it that often. Wardens prefer to use the Malone, which I agree with. Well, the mobile Malone up here. So, tripod weapons aren't that super high priority for Wardens, so you don't need a lot of tripod mounted weapons. So, the Ratcatcher, unfortunately, isn't that significant. So, goes under C tier. I almost want to put it under D tier, but sometimes you just need a Ratcatcher to hold the position, and you sort of set it up, and then a random infantry will jump on it and suppress an attacking wave. So you still want to see them, just not as frequently. Right, let's move on. Let's actually do all the tripod weapons for the Wardens. So the next one is the Cutler Foebreaker. This is a decent RPG platform. It gets outclassed by its mobile version significantly, but it's not completely useless, and this, as of some recent changes, has been seen as an ISG counter. So if there's an ISG firing on your position, you can quickly set up a Cutler. You can load 2 rockets into it, and then you can snipe the ISG before it can counterfire. And because the ISG is going to be high in the tier list, having some foe breakers to counter it is pretty good to have as well. And again, if you're playing in a naval hex, Cutlers is a premier choice for gunboats to mount on their hardpoints. So it is significantly more usable than the Ratcatcher in terms of its popularity. You do want to have some of them ready to go, so they go under B tier. But obviously, there is a better choice to using RPGs for that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, then it's the Mounted Bonesaw. This is also going to go under C tier for the Wardens. So this is the ARC RPG firing solution on a hardpoint. This is exceptionally good on gunboats because you can decrew Colonial gunboats with the ARC RPG very easily. You can also do some really funny things like ramming your gunboat near a shoreline and then firing some ARC rounds into vehicles that are not suspecting it. But in terms of mounting it in a trench and it seeing action, or putting it onto a Warden half-track, yeah, probably not going to see that much action. So have a couple of them available in the storage depot, but don't spam these. So you don't really be making a lot of them in the factory whatsoever. So put it under C tier. It's sometimes nice to have. Again, it's kind of like the Ratcatcher. Just it's sometimes nice to have, but there are better ways for Wardens to use ARC ammo. So we'll leave it at that. Cool. Right. So that's it for the Warden tripod weapons. Let's talk about some of their specialist and their PvE tools. So let's talk about the Cutler. Cutler is the premier Warden PvE tool. It goes into S tier. It's the main reason why the RPG is here. So you always want to be making Cutlers if you have spare Rmats to throw into making them. Yeah, definitely. For 35 Rmats for 5 Cutlers, which is like, and you need like 2 crates of it to make a Cutler team to mow down defenses. Goes without saying. Probably one of the strongest weapons in the game, alongside the Lunaire. So S tier. You always want to make Cutlers. So if you have the Rmats to spare, make Cutlers. Right, the next thing is the arm-mounted, or the shoulder-mounted Bonesaw Mark III. This shoots ARC ammo. This is slightly better choice for attacking vehicles with now. So it goes under A tier. Again, I know a lot of Wardens will say this is useless because it only has 30 meter range. Bro, you can sit in a trench and shoot out of the trench and never reveal your position with this thing. Okay? If a Colonial tank line dives, which is what we do with Colonial tanks, we dive them because we have short range and not that great sustainable fire. Bonesaw's awesome. You sit in a trench and you wait for a tank to come past and you blast it. And there's nothing the tank can do unless there's infantry to dive into the trench to kill you. It's a good weapon. What can I say? Yes, you need to crouch to shoot it. Yes, you need to lie down to shoot it. Yeah, I get it has some downsides. But compared to the state of the Flask and the state of the Level 20, I still think that's decent to have on the front. So you should be making it. And again, this is one of the reasons why the arc ammo is here for Wardens, or for both factions, but specifically for Wardens as well. You want the platform to fire it. And the Bonesaw Mark III isn't too bad. Yes, it costs 25 Rmats for only 5 of them. Sure. But would you rather not have them? That's the real question. Yeah. No, again, this is not a weapon tier list. I'm not going to talk about the balance of the darn thing. You need to have some of them on the front to deal with tanks diving. It's good for It's good to have a couple of infantry with these things sitting in a trench waiting for a tank to come past and you blast its treads out. So, for that reason, goes into A tier. Make them sometimes. It is okay. Okay, Warden Flamethrower. Wardens mostly rely on flame rockets and flame mortars to put things on fire. It is a fun weapon to have. I would make it sometimes, but not often. So it goes under C tier. Yeah. It's okay. It's an okay... It's the entry-level infantry way to put things on fire. You don't need a lot of them. You do need some of them. Goes into C tier. There are, if you specifically want to cause a large fire, there are better ways to do it. And the Warden rocket fire artillery is exceptional at putting things on fire. So you don't need to make a lot of these flamethrowers on the Warden side. They do have. It has a really long range. For 16 meters flamethrower, it's not bad. But yeah, leave it under C tier. Make it sometimes. A little bit expensive. 30 Rmats, but yeah, it's fine. Every now and then, have a couple of those ready to go. Alrighty, so that's it for all the Warden heavy arms. Let's go take a look at the Colonial ones. So, let's start off with the Colonial Unique AP RPG. You want lots of these because all our late game anti-tank weapons use AP RPGs. So, S tier, late game, make lots of them. Yeah, not much else to say. We have two weapon platforms that shoot them. Both of them are good in their respective fields. So you want to make sure that they have the ammo in en masse on every front. So definitely put that under S tier. And on that notion, let's actually talk about the two weapons that fire them. So here you have the Bane 45. The Bane 45 is hated by all Wardens because it has really long range and really high penetration chance. You have 5 or 6 of these sitting in a line and they all fire at once and you can start insta-killing medium tanks. You have 10 of these sitting in a line, you start insta-killing BTs. It is a good weapon. However, controversial take. You don't want to see too many of these on the front. So I'm going to put them on par with the mounted or shoulder mounted Bonesaw, because if you have 1 or 2 infantry firing them, their impact is not as great as compared to the Venom. Now the Venom also shoots AP RPG, but you don't need to be in an entrenched position to use it. This weapon can be fired on the run, out of bushes, out of flanks, out of, has high mobility. This is an exceptional AP RPG platform. I always want to see front lines stocked with these. It's the main reason why AP RPG should be prevalent on the Colonial side. So Venoms are exceptionally good, and in my opinion, should be prioritized into making them, because it's fine to have a couple of infantries with AP RPG Venoms as opposed to Banes. Banes require a lot of coordination, a lot of strategy to use. The Venoms is kind of like you pull one out and then you shoot a random tank and you track it and then it's dead. Really nice to have. So I put the Venom in a higher priority to make. And yeah, it's also the fact that Banes cost a lot more. Banes cost 40 refined materials and Venoms only cost 15. So I can have almost 3 times the number of Venoms than I can with the Banes. So I would rather have more Banes. So Venoms are just better for its cost efficiency and their general usability compared to the Bane. So S tier, definitely, for the Colonial side. Cool. Colonial tripod weapons. Let's talk about the ISG. The ISG is awesome. You want to be making lots of them. They go into A tier. This is the main way that Colonials make use of 30mm and spam it everywhere. So definitely make the ISGs, specifically when they tech. You will be making them in tripod factories as well. So they don't go into S tier because they do have a better, more efficient way of being produced en masse later on. But for 5 Rmats, for the ability to shoot a billion 30mm, which is dirt cheap, yeah, it's good. Goes into A tier and doesn't go down. The ISG has seen some nerfs in its reload rate, but it also seen some buff in its HP. Again, not a weapons tier list. But in terms of priority tripod weapons for Colonials to make, the ISG definitely goes in there. Okay, Lamentum. Hot take. Lamentums are absolutely amazing. In my opinion. These are S tier. You want to see billions of these things everywhere for Colonials because of their range, their ability to snipe infantry, their ability to suppress other tripod weapons, to suppress push guns. These are awesome. Okay, I put this as a bit of a meme as S tier, but they actually are deserving of A tier as well. They are infinitely better than the Ratcatcher. I don't think anyone can dispute this. The Ratcatcher does more damage, but these things, you will outsnipe the Ratcatcher before the dude even gets to counterfire. So it is an A tier weapon. You want to see lots of these. So if you have spare Rmats to spare, and you're not making Venoms, like if you have like 5 Rmats left, and you're like, what should I make with this? If there's enough ISGs in the front, then make Lamentums. It's a great weapon. You can't go wrong with it. A tier. Personally, I would put this as S tier, but that's because I really enjoy using Lamentums, and this is not a weapon tier list. Okay, Typhons. Typhons are in a really bad spot. I am still trying to figure out how to use this properly. 20mm is weird. The Neville 20s got hit massively. The Typhons got hit even more because, at least with the Neville, you can move and shoot. The Typhon, you need to now put in a fixed position. I'm still figuring this one out, and a lot of Colonials agree with me. This is not a great weapon to have everywhere anymore. It used to be good to defend against chieftain rushes, because you like shoot out the tracks of a chieftain as it's like approaching your base. This used to be a high priority for outlaws to shoot out of trenches or mounted onto trenches, because it was really scary, getting disabled or getting fueled or getting your armor penned by one of these 20mm shots. It doesn't do that anymore. So until we figure out exactly what to do with the Typhon and its place in the meta, it goes, unfortunately, into D tier, and it hurts my soul. It is also completely worthless against gunboats, in part to some stupid YouTuber guy who made videos about 20mm being too overpowered. Like, gee, I wonder who did that. But still, yeah, 20mm, useless against ships. Useless against most defensive, or useless in most defensive situations. It has some really, really niche use on half tracks, and that's about it. So, for the people who want to use Typhons, they will make it themselves and probably throw it out the window after they figure out it doesn't really do that much damage anymore. So don't make Typhons, waste of resources. I would rather have 10 crates of Ratcatchers over 1 crate of Typhons. And that's really sad because I used to love this thing so much. Okay. So that's it for Colonial tripod weapons. Let's talk about their PvE tools. So the Lunaire grenade launcher, S tier. Yeah, I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. It's an amazing weapon. You can fire and turn and fire and turn and fire. It combos really well with a grenadier uniform. You want to see billions of these on the front line on the Colonial team. It is our quote-unquote cutler. So, yeah, not going to sugarcoat it. Make Lunaires. Can shoot gas grenades. Sometimes shoot smoke grenades, and that's that useful. Yeah. Oh, I forgot the Colonial. Forgot the Colonials had a tripod-mounted grenade launcher. This is crap. Again, this tech's like 1 or 2 tech levels before the Lunaire, and then it's irrelevant. Do I even want to put it in C tier? No, I really don't. If I have tripods, this is not worth the tripod it's placed on top of. That's how meh I am about the Fissura grenade launcher. So the Lunaire is awesome, because you put a grenadier uniform on and you go ham, you just spam grenades everywhere. This thing, It also has worse range than the Lunaire. There's no reason to build this unless it's like a very niche gunboat strategy that you're doing with it, like shooting like tremolas off of a gunboat onto land. Maybe it's useful, but right now, no, don't make these. Waste of Rmats. Rather save up and make their mobile infantry grenade launcher form, which is exceptionally good. Yeah. Don't make the Fissura. I mean, goodness gracious, we have a built-in Fissura with the Nemesis, and that made the Tremola more useful. Even though the Nemesis can only shoot Tremolas, it completely the Nemesis took over the only niche use case where you might want to see a lot of Fissuras in the front, where you would like mount it on a half track and use it. That necessity has gone away, so it's better to just don't make this thing. I'm going to stop harping on about it. Don't make this thing. It's the people who want to use it will make it themselves. Cool. All right. Colonial PvE covered. Let's talk about some of the niche weapons that we have, and there's 2 items left. So for the Colonial Ignifist, this is our equivalent. Well, I would say equivalent, but this is our quote-unquote equivalent to the Flask. Now, surprisingly, I think the Ignifist has gotten better in its usability because of the armor shred mechanics. So I have seen more Ignifists meet their mark in the infantry update than ever before. And I think this has to do with the fact that armor is shredded very nicely now with the use of Dawns on the front line. So, previously, I would have put the Ignifist under C tier. I'm actually going to put it into B tier. Use Ignifists against tanks that have their armor damaged. And because of this, I would like to see more Ignifists inside frontline bunker bases. So you need more crates of them everywhere. They're not as good as the Sticky or the AP-RPG. This is not in question. I'm not putting into question that the AP-RPG and the Sticky Grenade performs better at destroying tanks. But killing tanks that have their armor hurt, the Ignifist is seeing more use cases for. And this is slowly becoming more common, and I really like this. Just as a really, really niche example, yesterday I was fighting on the front, and a HDD with its armor damaged ran over a mine. He got stuck, and I was able to run and shoot 2 Ignifists into its front armor because his sides were covered by infantry, so I couldn't go to the sides. But I was able to pen an HDD that had its armor shredded from the front using Ignifists. So I think Ignifists have a new life to them. They can destroy enemy armor that have their systems or their actual armor plating damaged. So B tier. I think the Ignifist is getting there. Even though you can't auto-equip it, just having 1 or 2 of them that you have to manually equip yourself makes them decent. Still not as good as Sticky Grenades, still not as good as AP-RPG, but they're getting there. So let's see more of them. So I'm going to put them under the B tier for cooking items. Again, not a weapons tier list, but they're decent to see more of now because of how armor shred works. Okay, Colonial Flamethrower. That's going to go as the same as the Warden one. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Incendiary mortars are better, even though Colonials don't rely on fire rockets as much. Fire mortars are just exceptional. So flamethrowers, again, it's nice to have a couple of them every now and then, but you don't want every infantry to have one, so it goes under C tier. Cool. Okay, so that's it for all the Colonial heavy arms. I'm pretty comfortable with that. Not going to change anything. Definitely, the big one for this category for heavy arms is the Tremolas is S tier and RPGs is S tier for their respective teams, and then you can clearly see that they have some niche cases elsewhere. Cool. Next, let's talk about heavy ammunition. So heavy ammunition is weapons that only get loaded into vehicles or pushguns. So broadly speaking, I'm going to be mostly talking about their cost efficiency and where they're most useful for. So don't expect to see this everywhere. For both factions, I have to do a faction split for one of the ammo types, but for the most part, because they use heavy explosive, which use sulfur, there is some cost associated into making these weapons. But, I mean, yeah. Let's jump right into the first one. 120. So this is the first true, quote-unquote, artillery munition that we have. 120 is useful for destroying structures and is useful for suppressing infantry. It's not as useful at assailing vehicles, and it is also pretty good at dealing with ships. So because of its cost, purely because of its cost of using only a small amount of heavy explosives, I will put them under A tier. If you have some spare heavy explosives and you're cooking at a factory, you want to be making 120 with this. 120 is strong, generally useful, good defensively, destroying tier 2 structures, stopping a push. Yeah, I would deploy 120, and having a factory to pre-cook it is not a bad decision to make. Okay, 150. Now, 150 is objectively better in every single way when you are assailing a position, because 150 actually damages vehicles and it completely shreds structures. However, this is expensive. This is an expensive munition to make. So, for 60 heavy explosive powder and you're sitting in front of a factory, I wouldn't be making too many of these unless you are preparing for an incoming attack or you're preparing for an op. You want to see a lot of 150 pre-prepared, but ammo factories producing them on the front has higher priorities, because you can build these in any, you can make these at any facility inside of a hex that only has a refinery in it. And in that scenario, this, when produced at a factory, because this is a factory Logi tier list, goes into C tier. You don't want to be making too many of these. Even though it's an objectively better shell, it is better made in ammo factories, facilities near the front. 120s is fine because it's cheap. It's a cheap material to make. You can make multiple crates of 120 as opposed to multiple crates of 150. And you don't want to clog up your Logi towns with 150. If you're an ammo runner in an artillery op, you're going to be looking for large shell factories on the front to pull more pallets to then get to your guns and fire. You're probably not going to do that much by making lots of these in the back line. Useful to have, but it's made in facilities more. So 120s is fine to make, but niche use cases for 150s. And along this exact same logic, the same goes for 250. 250s are made more common in ammo factories on the front because to make 250 in a facility, you don't need an upgraded facility to do it. You do need the upgraded large shell factory to make 250. You can make 250 in any ammo factory in the game. So C tier. Don't spend your HE resources making this. There are better things to use your HE resources, your heavy explosive materials. So don't waste this on 150 and 250. And again, this is purely the reason why 120 is A tier here is because it's cheap. Cheap artillery shells. Useful in ships as well. 150 and 250. Better made inside factories, dedicated facilities, and large regiments that specialize in making artillery. They'll be producing these, so don't worry about making them in factories. Cool. Okay. 40 mil tank ammo. This is a top priority, but this is really expensive. This is incredibly expensive. So this is better made in mass production factories. But if you are making if you're going to be making anything inside of your factory queues, this is probably the one that you want to make. If you have the heavy explosive powder to make this, I would make 40 mil over 150, 250, and 120, just because all your main battle tanks use them. Like your main production tanks, your light tanks. This is the premier PvE tool to have once your armor gets unlocked at any point throughout the war. So always make 40 mil out of this tab. So this is why this is getting S tier. You always want to be making this one. Now, the final one to talk about is 68 mil. And this is where we have to have the faction split again. So I'm going to make a copy real quick. And do a green border and a blue border. So for Wardens, 68 mil goes into S tier as well, just because most of your anti-tank solution uses 68 mil for Wardens. So your heavy tank destroyer is a very easily deployable anti-tank solution, and they use a lot of 68, and they're very effective at using it in combination with their emplaced 68 mil guns as well. So Wardens always want to see 68 mil in the front, because their EATs and their HDDs and their silver hands and their push guns, they all use 68 mil as their base launch platform. Now for Colonials, even with the introduction of the Nemesis and the increase in usage of Bardishas and their ammo consumption, these only go into B tier. Just purely on the fact that only our vehicles use 68 mil in this scenario. And yes, it's a cheap munition type to have, but if you want to push a front and you want to destroy bases for Colonials, 40 mil is our main platform for use. We use it in our Spathers, we use it in our Falchions, we use it in our light tanks, and Wardens, when they're mostly playing defensively, will favor 68. And again, that's my sort of reasoning with it. So if you're a Colonial factory maker or factory enjoyer, you want to be mostly focusing on making 40 mil. And if you're a Warden, sometimes you always want to mix in 68, just because you have more platforms to shoot 68 mil than the Colonials do. With their EAT, with their silver hand, their main battle tank uses 68 as well as 40 mil. You want both shells at the ready for them to use. Whereas, yeah, if you're a Colonial, more useful to have 40 mil on hand. Okay, I know this is probably going to ruffle some feathers, but I don't put 68 as high as a priority as 40 mil. I do put 68 as a high priority for Colonials once we get the battering ram, but the battering ram doesn't see much late gameplay. Just because the Nemesis right now will probably eat up all your 68 mil shots alongside the Bardishas. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Again, that's my sort of priority for making these resources and their cost efficiency, specifically when it comes to high explosives. Cool. All right, now for the most part, that sort of covers weapons in general. Now we're going to go into utility, medical, and uniforms. So these will hopefully be a little bit more objective because both sides use them relatively the same. So I don't really see a big faction split in their usefulness for what you should prioritize making. So actually, let's talk about the faction split ones, just so that they're completely out the way. There's a very small number of these. So for the Warden utility items, we have the the Willow's Bane ammo. This goes with the flamethrowers, so I'll put this under C tier. Just when you're producing the flamethrower, make ammo for it. You don't need to out-spam the number of flame ammo you need to make for it, because most infantry can only carry one flame backpack per Willow's Bane flamethrower with it. So just pair these two up when you make them and don't go overboard. But again, you do want to see some of it because you do want to see some flamethrowers on the front as well. Right. Warden Osprey. So this is the Warden quote-unquote equivalent to the Lunaire in terms of grenade launching. Now, obviously the Lunaire is used for PvE because it can shoot high explosive rounds, but the Osprey is useful for shooting gas grenades and sometimes launching Varsies at support weapons or, the odd tracked tank. Wardens do want to see Ospreys, but for the most part, the Cutler performs that role better because it can kill. You do want to see Ospreys, so I'm going to put this under B tier. They are relatively cheap to make. So 10 refined materials makes 20. So it has a good trade-off. Therefore, you don't need to spam a whole bunch of them to get them in the hands of infantry. So again, you use this to launch gas grenades and the odd Osprey. The odd Varsi. So goes under B tier, has some usability. It's not worthless and it's not low priority. So B tier fits comfortably for it. And obviously it can also, you can also shoot Harpers with it. So not a bad way to get Harpers into the faces of your enemy. Cool. All right. That's it for the faction specific utility items. Except for the satchel charge and the havoc charge, which I think might be a good idea to go and talk about as well. Let's just kind of get it out the way. So let me just find the satchel charge. Seems like the wiki page has it missing. So alligator charge. So this is the Warden sort of partisan anti-structure weapon. This is useful for breaking bases. You do want to see them a little bit on the front. So I'm going to put them under B tier. Do you want to see tons of them in every single relic base or every front base, specifically to, rush structures? They're very useful to have. Actually, I think I'm going to put them under A tier because they are a premier way to destroy safe houses, as well as it is a better option for satchel rushing certain key defensive positions. Wardens have a bit of a unique thing where they can carry multiple of these. So we do sometimes see like one Warden carrying like 7 of these, walking into a base and then blowing a whole bunch of stuff up. But this is purely if there is no enemies around or there's no real PvE tools to fight against them. So very useful. A lot of the sort of tap ops videos that we see heavily make use of satchels as well. So they are a decent item to produce, but they lack high utility, which is where the Colonial equivalent is going to outclass it just a tiny, tiny amount. But overall, alligator charges, good to have. Do make them every now and then. They can, like I said, they can sort of break defensive positions by infantry if they can get close enough or if the enemy is not defending very, very well. Cool. All right, so that's it for the Warden Utility unique items. I'm going to switch the tab back to Colonials. So Colonials have 2 unique utility items, and that is our flame ammo. This is for the flamethrower. This goes under C tier. Again, just make it when you make the Molten Wind Lance, or Flame Lance, whatever it's called. But other than that, you probably don't need to prioritize it that much at all. Okay, Colonial Hydra's Whisper. Now, this is on par with the Satchel, but this does more damage, and you can destroy minefields and barbed wire with it. This is an S tier weapon for Colonials. You always want to be making Hydras. Like, If you have the opportunity to cook hydras in the factory, go and make them. You can't go wrong. So this is just an objectively better PvE tool. Yes, you can only carry one of them, but the most optimal play to use satchels is to only carry one of them as well. So Hydra rushes are awesome. They're very fun to participate in as well. But overall, the utility and the destructiveness of the Hydra Whisper makes it a top priority to cook in the factories. So alongside Lunaires and Tremolas, Hydras are also a strong option for Colonial Infantry to make use of. So I always want to see tons of Hydra's Whispers everywhere on the battlefield, and I think most Demolition Bros would agree with me on that one. It is just a better PvE tool. Satchels you can carry multiple of in weird niche, no AI scenarios. But Hydras, carrying a single Hydra, dropping it, deploying it, and then punching Wardens, super fun, super useful, and the ability to clear out mines definitely have its use case. So S tier weapon and S tier thing to make inside of the utility tab, absolutely cool. All right, so the next thing to talk about is the sort of generic utility items that you can produce from this tab. So let's kick things off with the listening kit. The listening kit allows you to tap intel. It is a little bit pricey. It costs 150 BMATs to make and requires a tripod to mount it on top of. But generally speaking, you do want to see some of them on the front. So I'm going to put them under A tier. Definitely make them every so often. Just having a queue of listening kits go into your shipping containers to go to the front is always a welcome need. Tapping enemy intel is vital when you're going to be attacking into position, and exceptionally vital if you're going to defend against the naval invasion. Whenever we think that the enemy team is bringing large ships in to bombard an area, we will always send scouts out in motorboats to find every rock and crevice to spam listening kits everywhere. So having listening kits specifically to be prioritized inside of your naval hexes cannot be understated. So you always want to have a somewhat decent supply of it. It's not S tier, you don't need to have thousands of these, but you do need to have a couple dozen on hand to tap any enemy intel. So definitely make them every so often. All right. So the next thing to talk about is, let's talk about the tripod, just because I think it goes in hand with the listening kit. So the tripod, you need it to mount all your various items on. It is useful to have when compared in combination with all the various tripod weapons that we have, on top of all the utility items that we have. I'm going to put tripods under A tier. You can also make lots of them, and you can't go wrong. I will say later on in the game, you will have tripod factories that produce them for relatively cheap. So maybe I'll move this down to B tier in terms of its priority to make. But yeah, okay. So this is one of those witches situations where if you are supplying a front that doesn't have a lot of facilities, then it goes into A tier. But if you're just producing in the backline and you're not 100% sure where those resources are going to go, like it's being decided by a large regiment, then having tripods is probably not that high priority, because they're probably producing them en masse and cheap inside facilities, because this is one of the items that you can produce in a facility for very, very cheap. But in terms of the fact that it is a utility item and it can be used in a wide variety of scenarios, I'm going to put it under A tier. But when you're producing from a factory, maybe ask in region if someone else is producing tripods for publicly use, and prioritize sending those to the front instead. But for factories, A tier, can't go wrong. You use it for so many things. There's an entire laundry list of things that you can use tripods for, on top of just the tripod itself. Like you can block bridges with tripods and do funny things with them and make ladders and stuff with them. They're fun. So yeah, great utility item. You should be making them. Goes into A tier. All right, let's talk about, while we're in the process of talking about things that can be made, let's talk about 3 more items that are producible in the factory utility tab. This being barbed wire and the metal beam and the sandbag. So these are very cheap, very quick to make materials inside of factories. In terms of making them at a factory, barbed wire and sandbags go hand in hand. Generally speaking, you don't need to make a whole lot of them, and there will usually be assembly bay facilities in the front that spam these. So overall, I'm going to put them in D tier because there are just more efficient ways of making them, because they are produced as a side product in facilities. So when you're using a facility structure to make them, you get construction materials and a roll of barbed wire with them. And these are one of the things that are better to be transported to the front using a pallet and then rapidly deployed to, like, you know, on top of entrenchments or trenches themselves, or built on top of defensive positions. It's better to move these by pallet and not so much by crates. Yes, they are sometimes handy to dump in a frontline push bunker, but again, in scenarios like that, it would be better to just drive a truck of 15 of them to do a very specific thing, mostly to upgrade trenches so that the enemy can't fire out of it or that they can't run into it. So put them under D tier, and then metal beams, again, also goes into D tier, just because they don't. The utility of making them in the factory is lower priority than just having them available inside of a frontline assembly bay, or like 1 hex away, that you can take a specific number for to use, or dump a pallet and do something specific with them. So yeah, even though they're cheap to make and they're quick to make, you don't need to clog them up in the backline, because we also have to consider that you need to physically move the crates of items to a midline or a frontline storage depot that then gets distributed to all the bunker bases. And in scenarios like that, I'm going to weigh putting in a crate of sandbags versus putting in a crate of 12.7 ammo. I would rather take a crate of 12.7 ammo in a storage container than a crate of sandbags. So yeah, let me put it this way. If you're going to be building and making use of sandbags in your like frontline construction or in your like mega fortress of doom, you're going to be bringing in your own pallets of sandbags and barbed wire to use them. You're not going to be relying on a factory to make them. So yeah, the people who want to use them will have a more efficient way of using them. You don't need to prioritize making them in a factory. That's basically why they end up in the D tier. So you can safely ignore them and life will persist. Everything will be fine. Cool. Let's talk about some explosives. So here we have the Havoc detonator and the Havoc charge. So these are 2 exceptionally good weapons. Well, you need both of them to use them. So you use the detonator on top of the charge to make it explode. These go under A tier. These are concrete destroyers, and you can kill bunker bases and town bases with 1 of 2 of them. So this is a weapon that you bring into a fight after you've taken control of a region or taken control of a target for a couple of seconds. So if you want to destroy a town base, for example, you rush infantry in with bayonets and gas grenades, etc. You take control of the spawns, and then you bring in 2 guys, each carrying 1 of those items, and then they set it down and they explode it, and then it crumbles to dust. Also, Havoc charges got a massive buff in the infantry update because you now can place them inside of structures. Previously, you couldn't do that, so they are premier safe house destroying and town base destroying weapons now. So they go under A tier. They previously were around B to C tier because they were only used in very specific scenarios, or you would have regiments that would specialize in making and using them, like they wouldn't make them in public. But because of their usability now, you do want to put them under A tier. But very importantly, when you are making these in a factory, always ensure that you make them in tandem. Don't just make detonators or just make charges. Always produce them in a 1-to-1 ratio whenever you are cooking them for the frontline usage. But yes, great weapon, very high explosive damage. They don't have the same utility as a Hydra in terms of removing barbed wire or landmines or dragon's teeth, but they are good. So put them under A tier. Do make them. They are worth the heavy explosive investment. So yeah, this is essentially an infantry 250. So instead of needing a tank to shoot it, you can take 2 guys, rush in and blow something up and do 250 millimeter worth of damage, more or less. The math isn't perfect, but you get the idea. They're useful to have, so not going to go on too much about them as such. Okay, the next thing is water buckets, utility item. You want to see some of them. It goes into B tier. For really large fires, water buckets don't do anything. For really large fires, you need a fire truck. But if the enemy is just randomly assailing you with fire mortars, like 1 or 2 fire tubes to put a bit of fire on, and you don't want things to get out of control, you would like to have some buckets available on the front line. I would put this under like S tier, as in I want to see them everywhere, but you don't need thousands of crates to them. So it's going to go in the scenario of like once you have 1 or 2 crates in every single bunker base, you don't need more of them. So they get a B tier priority in terms of the actual utility that they provide. And if there's no fire, or if it's raining, which, you know, probably something that we see more of in the Colonial side, you don't need buckets at all, because the weather will deal with fire that you have. Oh, wait a second, hold up. On the side tandem, if you're a Colonial and you're building a bunker base in the back line, you do need buckets, because puddles. Man, I can't build my fancy emplaced, machine gun because a puddle is blocking it. Yay. And the best way to deal with puddles is the bucket. The shovel doesn't work as well. So, bit of a higher priority. Actually, and because of money, I need to think about. Hold up. Muddy vehicles. You can no longer remove mud by packaging vehicles either. Okay, I know it stays on B. It just justifies B for me more. I don't even go to A, but yeah, more utility out of the bucket. Thanks, Dev Man. Okay, we'll leave it as B tier. Still useful to have. Cool. Right. So done all that. Let's go to shovels. Shovels is something that you always want lots of. It is very expensive. It goes into A tier. You build bunker bases with it. You attack with trenches with it. You attack puddles with it. You look menacing holding one. I don't know, for some reason, whenever I hold a shovel, I get sniped or shot at by 40 mil. I don't know why. It's an intimidation factor. It's cool. You can't shovel coal with it for some reason. Doesn't make sense, but yeah. You need shovels to build stuff. It's the entry-level builder's tool for something that needs to go slightly underground. So yeah, shovels important. You want to have a decent amount of them. Always toss in some shovels into your factory queues when you're cooking them. Okay, next is gas masks and gas filters. Top priority for tankers. You always want to have a gas mask and a filter, but for general infantry, you don't need a whole lot of these. So I'm going to put them under B tier. When people are going out and doing tank ops and going to be running tanks for several hours, they should bring their own gas masks and filters. So we don't need to highly prioritize making lots of it. But it's still a general use case to have for defenders and builders and repairers that are defending against gas attacks, and the odd partisan that's going out and using gas to disrupt enemy supply lines. Also useful to have. Specifically if you're trying to decrew a tank and you want to outlast the gas attacks against them, you do need gas masks and filters on the people that are trying to remove them from vehicles. So useful items to have. Because of the changes of how gas grenades work, even though they are an S tier weapon, you don't need a whole bunch of infantry to have it because you can actually outrun gas grenade attacks now. So general infantry probably will avoid using gas masks, but vehicles and builders and defenders and repairers, they need gas masks, absolutely. And people sitting inside of town base firing ports, definitely gas mask and filters. So put it on a B tier. Do make them every often. So I'll leave them on that tier list. And it's so weird seeing gas masks and filters next to buckets, but yeah, so it's the current balance of things. Cool. All right, let's talk about radio backpacks. I really like radio backpacks. They got a significant buff on their range, and they are usable inside of vehicles for the map update now. Previously, if you had a radio backpack and you were inside of a vehicle, your map would never update. Now it does. Awesome. So I've seen the light of having more radio backpacks on the front, so I put them under B tier. They're exceptional to have as a scout or as a partisan, so you can see enemy positions around you and update your own map. Yeah, you can't go wrong. Radio backpacks are awesome. Definitely make a couple of them, and everyone will appreciate you for it. Okay, next is the Premier Triple Utility items. The first is the radio. You always want 1,000 radios everywhere. They update the map. S tier. You always want radios on the front. So you want to have containers and containers and containers of radios. It's usable by literally every role in the game. Builders, tankers, artillery. You need to have radios, and exceptionally important if you're stockpiling relic bases and bunker bases that are used for QRF teams, which is the people that defend against an enemy incursion or partisans. So definitely want to have radios. S tier item, always make them. Relatively cheap to make as well. 75 BMATs for a crate of 5. Definitely worth the BMAT investment. The next is the wrench, the second member of the Premier Utility item trifecta. You always want to have wrenches inside of your frontline bases as well. You use them for everything from dismantling barbed wire and landmines to also wrenching vehicles, and sheer utility of them goes without saying. You always want to have wrenches. That's just another thing that you just want to have lots of. And then finally, binoculars, mostly used by tankers and artillery crew and scouts. Again, the last member of the super useful utility team. You want to make lots of binoculars. Whenever I'm sitting in front of a factory and making items in the utility tab, I'm always making a variation of these 3 in groups of 4. So I'm always making like 4 radios, then 4 wrenches, then 4 binos, and then I just rotate in my factory loops. Yeah, what can I say? You use them throughout the entire game, from the very start of the war to the very end. You always want these 3. So spam them like crazy, and everyone will love you for it. Right, next is going to be a couple of sort of sundry items. Sledgehammers. Even though this is high priority for logistics guys, and, besides the meme of, yes, I finally unlocked sledges, you don't need to spam making these. They're only made by the people who are actually collecting salvage and components and sulfur in the back lines. You don't need to have sledgehammers on the front line or the midline logistical hubs at all. Again, this is one of the scenarios where if you're going to be using sledgehammers, you will bring the crate of your own. You're not going to rely on some public stockpile to give you sledgehammers. So you don't need to make them. The moment these get introduced as alternative melee weapons, this is going to go to S tier, and I'm not even going to argue it. I mean, you literally hold the sledgehammer like a claymore sword when it goes into combat. It's so awesome. Wait, hold on, I'm going to side tangent now. Yeah, okay. This picture doesn't do it justice, but like when you go into combat and you're running, it's literally like you look like a knight holding a sword going into combat. So the moment sledgehammers can bonk enemies to death, it's going to go into S tier just because of the swag. But yes, back on topic, on serious note, you don't need to make sledgehammers unless you are going to go to a field and mine components. Then you bring your own crate of sledgehammers. You know, that's the sort of deal. Cool. Bayonet. That is the next item. This is a cheap tool that you can attach to your basic rifles, some specialist rifles too. This is an okay utility item to have. You don't need to cover every single bunker base in them. And 1 or 2 crates is sufficient to supply enough bayonets that they can be impactful. So I'm going to put them under B tier. Due to the changes to how bayonets work in combat, they have seen less usage, but they are still decent enough to have available that you should make them every so often. So definitely not C tier, definitely not D tier, but it's also not an S tier weapon like they used to be, because you used to slap on a bayonet and then like kill 10 guys and then finally get taken out by a random 40 mil shot by a tank that just had enough of you. But yeah, as is, still decent, just not high priority. So put them under B. Cool. And then there's one more item that in the wiki page, for some reason, it doesn't show up. So I'm just quickly going to search for it. And that is the windsock. So the windsock basically is a tripod weapon that you obviously need a tripod for, that basically teaches people how to use artillery. This is a D tier weapon. This is a D tier item to make in a factory. You need some of them when artillery starts being relevant, just so that newer artillery crews can sort of understand how wind conditions work. But for any seasoned vet, we just build a rifle garrison, and that gives enough information about wind for us to not need to make them. Now, this is not a dog whistle for the the devs to change the flag system on garrisons. I am so accustomed to using a Dawn watchtower to tell what the strength and direction of wind is, that I don't want the devs to go, oh, we should change that and then make the windsock more relevant. You don't need to make windsocks. Don't force us to make them, dev man. So right now it's S tier. Definitely make lots of it. No, it's D tier. Just if you're gonna need a windsock, you'll make your own. You don't need to supply them in the front line. Make a couple. Put a couple like sometime mid-war. Toss them in a storage depot, and I promise you it'll probably last until the end of the war. So make a couple, but that's about it. Okay, finally done with utility. Phew, it's a lot of items, but very important that you understand that radios, binos, wrenches, can't go wrong with them. Always toss them in to your factory queues. All right, now let's talk about medical gear. So there's one item that sits above all items in the game, and that is soldier supplies. And soldier supplies you need all the time. This is hands down the most important item in the game, and it is undisputed by everyone. If you ever just want to make one thing in a factory, it is the S tier item. That is soldier supplies. Undisputed king or queen of the factory. And whenever I'm sitting in a factory, this is the number one item that I'm producing all the time. Yeah. Having players spawn is important. It is the giver of life of Foxhole. So soldier supplies go into the top priority. If I'm sitting in front of a factory, 9 out of 10 times my medical tab is just making soldier supplies non-stop. And I will happily send a train full of soldier supplies to a midline logistical hub so that we can distribute it to all the bunker bases everywhere. Yeah, you need soldier supplies? Always make them. It is the best item in the game to make in the factory. It's the main reason why factories are still relevant in the game, if I'm going to be honest. DevMan is slowly going to phase out more stuff from the factory. We've already seen mines and stuff disappear from factories. We are never going to see soldier supplies being removed unless there's a massive change in the war economy of Foxhole. So always make soldier supplies. And I don't think anyone will disagree with me on that one. Okay. Next to the medical tab is bandages. Ooh, and that icon is really small. Let me make these icons a little bit bigger. Bandages. Bandages are another S tier item to make. If I'm not making soldier supplies, I'm making bandages, because bandages can be used by individual soldiers as well as medics. Medics use them a lot more because they can actually heal, but to stop a bleed effect, which is very, 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 very prevalent now since the infantry update, a lot more weapons can bleed very easily for low amounts of bullet output. Having a bandage to stop bleeding, very important. So if I'm not making a queue of soldier supplies, I am making a queue of bandages. Just bandages, no other utility things. Just so that soldiers can stop the bleeds from a random fiddler or random bowman stone hitting them. So yeah, very important. Make bandages if you're not making soldier supplies. Okay, then in terms of the medical kit, very useful. Again, since you're going to be seeing a lot of bandages being made, this one will also be quite prevalent in terms of its usability. It's not just used by medics, it's used by partisans and pushgun operators and artillery teams as well, because sometimes you just randomly take a hit from a area of effect or splash attack, and you want to patch up multiple people, and just having a random infantry or a random tanker or a random support infantry to have a medical kit on hand on top of it being used by medics is very, very handy. So yeah, you always want to have medical gear available to be used, so it combos well with the fact that there will always be lots of bandages. And bandages also, because you get a lot of bandages per crate, there's no reason to not have some medical gear, medical kits on hand nearby as well. So yeah, good item to have. So it belongs in A tier. On that note, trauma kits, very useful for medics, very useful to have on the front as well. More often than not, you get one random dude that gets knocked down and he gets picked up and he gets run back to the town base. And it's always disheartening that if the town base does not have a trauma kit on hand to revive him, and you're going to have to invest in a shirt to replace that spawned player. So trauma kits and their accompanying blood plasma, always make these two in tandem. They are also A tier. But unlike bandages, which can be used independently, blood plasma needs to be loaded into a trauma kit for it to be used. Unless you're a sneaky vampire and you like to drink it, you weirdo. But yeah, blood plasma, good to have if you have trauma kits to support them. Otherwise, make shirts. Easiest way to put it. Cool. All right, that's it for medical gear. Let's move on to resources. There's only one resource in the game, under the resource tab, that is maintenance supplies. Maintenance supplies goes into D tier. You don't need to ship this up to the front, and they are very, very, very expensive to make in factories. Maintenance supplies is better produced in mass production factories, and specifically inside of materials factories that are situated right next to salvage spawning entities like a salvage field or a salvage mine. You don't need to make maintenance supplies, and infantry don't need maintenance supplies in their frontline push bob. If you are needing maintenance supplies, you will make your own, and you don't need to cook them at the factory. It's only in very extreme situations where it's like 3% decay left on a random structure and you need some maintenance supplies to repair it. You're most likely even going to repair it with BMATs anyway. You're not going to toss maintenance supplies from a factory of all places to put it in. So yeah, don't make maintenance supplies in factories. It is just a waste of resources. It's so expensive. Yeah, 250 basic material. Yeah, it's crazy expensive. No. Yeah, stay away. Don't make it in a factory. Use a facility to do it, or use a mass production factory where you get a big discount for producing multiples. Yeah, that's it for maintenance supplies. You don't need to make it in a factory whatsoever. Okay, the final thing to talk about is uniforms. Now, uniforms is very faction specific. I know that there are some niche cases where you might want certain uniforms in certain scenarios. I am going to be using some generalizations here again. I will be representing the roles that closely bind the uniforms together just by the one team, and then the specialist, the faction unique uniforms, I will differentiate them again. But yeah, there are some priorities in certain uniforms that you need to make because they fundamentally change how the player uses weapons for that specific uniform. But for the most part, again, it's one of those scenarios where if you are going to an operation or if you're doing something specific that requires a specific uniform, like for example a tanker's uniform, generally speaking, people will bring their own uniforms for the task that they're trying to do. So this part of the tier list is more prioritized on if you want to give the general infantry population more options to gear up in. These are the sort of items that you need to make in terms of their uniforms. Okay, so very complicated way to tell you that uniforms are really, really niche. Certain scenarios might need them, some scenarios might not need them. So I'm going to give you a general rule for making uniforms in the factory for distribution to the front. All right, let's start with the obvious one. So let's talk about medical gear. So for Colonials, this is the medic fatigues, and for the Wardens, this is the physician's jacket, like so. These, when combined together, this goes into A tier. This fundamentally changes how infantry plays, so you do need to make some of them. So this is a decent uniform to make inside of the uniforms tab. All right, should be pretty straightforward. Medics save lives, and they elongate the usability of soldier supplies by using alternative resources that are much cheaper to make than a shirt. Cool. The next one to then talk about is the engineering uniforms. And the engineering uniforms is called the Fabry Rucksack for the Colonials. And it looks like that. And then the Wardens have the Sapper gear that looks like this. So for these two, not as high priority as the medical uniform, but they are still decent alternative to have because in a pinch, they can also be used for tankers uniforms. So I would prioritize making medical uniform over the engineering uniforms, but these are still good to have. And the utility of just carrying lots of BMATs and building defenses, very, very handy when you only need like a personal sidearm and nothing more. All right, so decent uniforms to have, do make them, but again, not as high priority as the medical gear because medical gear fundamentally changes how infantry play. Cool. All right, so the next thing to then take a look at is going to be recon gear. So for the Colonials, this is the recon camo. And then for the Wardens, this is the Outrider's mantle. In my opinion, this is the one infantry gear uniform that you always want in the front, because deception is a big part of infantry gameplay in Foxhole. Being able to sneak around enemy detection, to throw stickies at tanks, to dismantle artillery positions, to do partisan work, to hold positions, to scout, to spot. The sheer utility of not being visible on the enemy radar 100% of the time makes it so that recon gear is exceptionally useful to have. So if you're only producing one thing out of the outfit tab on a factory, this is the one thing that I would make lots of. Yeah, recon gear is awesome. It is my personal favorite gear to use, regardless if I'm playing Warden or Colonial, just because doing sneaky stuff feels awesome. And if you have 5 or 6 guys all in recon gear and they only show up as one blip on the radar, because it's just how the radar works, the enemy will not think it's a major threat, and then all of a sudden, boom, 5 guys appears, and your tank is covered in stickies, or covered in AP RPG rounds, and then it's all over. So yeah, top priority. I love making these, so I would definitely prioritize making them 4 by either side, and I will leave it at that. Right, the next thing to talk about is tanker gear. Now, late game, I do see some value in making these, just because having tankers with their corresponding gear is useful, specifically so that they don't get gassed out of their tanks. It is the number one thing that we tell new players that they need to have if they want to go tanking. They need the appropriate tank uniform on top of a gas mask and filter, and this protects their tank from being stolen. So I'll put it under B tier. In a pinch, it can also be used to repair and build stuff. I sometimes jump out my tank and go build toolboxes at night. So having the ability to stack B-mats is nice. So yeah. And in terms of drip, they're both equally cool. I like the Wardens have like a face cover and the cool hat. I don't know what the exact hat is called. Someone in the comments will correct me. But the, I don't know. Colonials have goggles, bro. I love it. I love the Colonial goggles. It's going to look cool inside of a cockpit, am I right? Yeah, anyway, regardless, useful to have, specifically late game. Specifically very, very late game where tanks are very, very prevalent everywhere and the game turns into World of Tanks. You want to have these available at all time. Okay, let's talk about the specialist uniforms. So for Colonials, we have the Grenadier outfit. This is an S tier outfit because it allows us to use tremolas more efficiently. So I always like to have Grenadier outfits, and this is a great outfit to have during the day to do sticky rushes because it reduces the weight of the stickies, which means you can carry multiple bunches of sticky grenades. You basically become a one-man tank destroying army when you have a Grenadier outfit on and you're carrying stickies. So really good. S tier for Colonials. If you're cooking in a factory, you can happily sit and make Grenadier uniforms and everyone will be very delighted when you bring it to the front. For Wardens, this is a little bit less of a priority. It doesn't help with the general infantry use to have the specialist overcoat available readily. It's mostly used by RPG teams and border teams that require a lot more coordination. So they are useful to supply in certain bunker bases, so it's decent to have a supply of them, but you don't need to spam them. Grenadier uniforms, you use them for sticky rushes and lunaire gangs, and those are a lot more biomass, everyone grab one and go. The specialist overcoat is you do a little bit more planning, you do a little bit more coordination before you toss it on. So it is, in the same vein, very, very strong. I do recommend Wardens make them in the factory, but in terms of do you want the biomass to have them? Probably not. It's better that they just stay in regular infantry gear or their scouts. And but for Colonials, if we're going crazy throwing mammons and sticky grenades and it's just complete frenzy, like a complete infantry frenzy, the Grenadier uniform actually provides a benefit. So having more of them is definitely more useful. Again, this is not a weapons tier. I'm not a uniform weapons balance tier list. This is a should you make lots of them? Specialist overcoat. Probably sometimes. Grenadier outfits, yes, because having all your infantry with Grenadier outfits is not a bad thing to have. Alrighty, that's about it in terms of what I regard as sort of useful uniforms. Now, there's a whole bunch of other uniforms in the game that you obviously all know, but those are so niche, I wouldn't spam them in the front. So, for example, I'm just going to toss them all under D tier. People who want to use these will bring them themselves. So the Valiant Flak Vest, it's really heavy. Definitely limits the mobility of the user. Don't need a lot of them. The Gunner's Breastplate, this is only used by people in submarines because if you're a Warden submarine user and I jump in your sub with a bayonet, you can have a bad time. So it's only used by submarine users. At least that's what I've been being told. The parka, the Warden parka that resists heavy snowstorms is only useful if it's snowing. So, yeah, if there's no snowstorms going on, you don't need to make them. So, situationally, don't bother. And the officer LARP uniform looks really cool, but hey, I don't like taking friendly fire from my own regiment, so I wouldn't make them. So don't make them en masse. Unless you're playing in WL, and then you can definitely make lots of them, because it's really funny to give all the officers officer uniforms. But yes, regardless, you don't need to make an officer's uniform. Let the regiment LARPers make those instead. Again, that doubles for the Colonial one. Doesn't provide any benefit other than it looks cooler, and it's only used by regiment officers, so no real need for it either. And then in terms of the Colonial Specialist gear, again, these are all just going to go into D tier. The raincoat is just run around the puddle, and then you don't need the uniform whatsoever. And then in terms of the... Oh, sorry, that's the snow outfit. The oil outfit. This is the rain one. Avoid the puddle, no problem. And then in terms of the snow one, again, unless it's snowing, you don't really need it. And in that scenario, you can just kind of huddle around inside of a trench and hug it out with your mates, and then everything will be fine. Okay, so all the other sort of niche, odd uniforms don't define the infantry roles at all. They're just a little bit of extra bonuses. So in summary, scout uniforms are exceptionally good because it removes a key part of the game from the enemy's counterplay, so they can't see you on the radar anymore. Grenadier uniform has vastly good utility in the fact that you can sticky rush more efficiently, you can throw grenades more efficiently, you can carry lots of lots of tremolas with your lunaire teams. Great to have. Medic uniforms is useful because it changes fundamentally how the infantry role works and allows you to stack medical gear, which is obviously very useful. Sapper and tank uniforms are good for their utility for carrying BMATs, and in a pinch they're interchangeable with one another, so always good to have them. And then everything else is kind of situational. Like if it's snowing, make snow uniforms. If it's raining, cool, make rain uniforms. But everything else, it's really, really mid, and not worth spending your BMATs on. I'd rather you spend your BMATs on your S tier make here as opposed to everything else. Okay, so that's it for the factory tier list. Again, thanks for listening to me up. It's probably gone on for a decent amount of time. But if you're sitting in front of a factory and you're trying to figure out what should I be making most of, S tier, then A tier, sometimes B tier, seldomly C tier, and then D tier you can comfortably avoid, given the explanations that I gave for everything. Right, now keep in mind, this is a dated video. This might change literally in like 3 days time when the new update is going to be revealed. DevMan might completely change how factories work. They've been doing a lot of stuff with the mini MPFs. We might see some additional recipes being added there. We might see some recipes removed there. But until those things change, this should serve as a general use case for using these items. So feel free to pause the video here and keep this open when you're cooking in your factories. As long as you make these items, I think everyone will appreciate your logistical support. All right, that's it for me. Again, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the YouTube comments. Feel free to debate me. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong, because your opinion matters. And I do read it all. And if I made a major mistake at something, I will make an amendment video in probably a couple months' time. Well, after DevMan has probably changed the balance of all these things again. So we'll see how things goes. Okay, that's it for me. And good luck in all future Foxhole wars.